Okay, welcome back. So far, we have seen how to do authentication ourselves. We build our own authentication, our own authorization baked in our application and built within our application. But recently, people and developers are more and more delegating or outsourcing this authentication to other providers. They don't need to deal with it anymore. Because really, if you look carefully, authentication is hard. It looks easy on the surface. You might just think, okay, I'll create a user interface with username and password, and I look up my database and check, and story ended. It's much deeper than this. So when you build a login or an authentication system, you have to deal with all these problems. You need to make sure that the passwords are saved securely, because if there is, in case of hacking, we hear a lot of leaking of passwords. You are responsible of these passwords. You need to provide a recovery of forgotten passwords. Users tend to forget their passwords. You need to make sure they choose a good password in the first place. And also, you need to detect if they log in from suspicious locations or from new devices, and other concerns in login. So it is hard. It's not just simple login screen as we saw in our previous discussion. So that's why, luckily, we don't need to deal with this authentication anymore. If we wish, we could delegate it to an identity provider. There are many identity providers out there, such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, and so many others. Microsoft, of course. And these identity providers, they provide a standard way of authenticating users and giving you details about the user, the user profile. That's the role of these identity providers. It is very beneficial for both the users and developers. For users, they just need to create one account and use it in many other applications. And for developers, they don't need to keep on creating this authentication again and again in every application they build. They just delegate it. And that's why a new standard has been adopted called OpenID Connect. And it allows us to do this authentication in a standard way. So this OpenID Connect allows us to use identity providers that are available on the web, such as Facebook and Google. And the way it works, you need to be familiar with the standard. That's what we will be doing now. And also you will need to be familiar with the API provided by each identity provider. So there is a standard. Luckily, they all follow the same standard, but they have different URLs and slightly different API. But the concept is the same, whatever provider you use. So in here, we will focus on Google as the identity provider, but the same experience can be used for other providers such as Twitter, Facebook, GitHub, and so on. So this is the diagram that really explains how it works. So there are many flows, there are many steps that how this authentication takes place. But in here, I'm focusing on the authentication flow used in case you have a SPA application. When you have a single page application, like the way we have been building our SPA application using Vue.js, this is one flow that you could use to authenticate users using an OpenID identity provider. So here is how it works. So we have the SPA application. The SPA application will redirect the users to the authentication endpoint. So we have an authentication provider. This authentication provider gives us a URL where we should redirect users to, and they go there and log in. I think it's easier. I'll show you first the end user experience, come back to this and explain what's going on behind the scenes. So let's jump and see an example of this. So As you can see here, in this simple example, I have the direct authentication that we built ourselves, and our application, the Hero application, can authenticate users. That's the traditional way of doing it. Now, another way of doing it is I delegate this authentication to Google in this case. So I'm sure you have seen this experience on the web. So now we will study this from the how of it as a developers, not only as an end user experience. So when I click here, what happens, as you can see, I am redirected to another URL. Have a look at the URL here. You are outside the Hero app. You are now on a Google app. And you can see here the URL is saying accounts.google.com/sign-in and so on. Okay, and then I'll type in my username and password. Because I have multiple Google accounts, I will choose the one I want to use to authenticate. And it didn't ask me because the password is saved. It should have asked me if my password was not saved. So what? If you are doing only authentication, it will not ask you for permission. If you are doing just authentication, just the fact that you are logging in, you are already giving consent to the user, to the app, to access your profile. So me as a user I have a Google account. So what I can do, I can go to this permissions myaccount.google.com, and I can see that I have given previously some permissions to other apps. One of them happens to be my Hero app. I just logged in now. So if I go there, you can see I am giving this app access to basic information about my profile. What is this basic information? I am giving access to the email address, and I'm also giving access to the basic profile info. So the fact that I am logging in, I am already giving my consent to the application to access these two pieces of information, the email and basic profile. Basic profile has first name, last name, gender, quite a lot of revealing private information. So let me just repeat this experience. So I will remove this one. So now I don't have the Hero app. By the way, you can see here as a user, I can go to my account and remove permissions that I gave before to other apps. Okay, so let me also try to log out, to sign out. Okay. Hopefully now it will ask me. Okay, let's see. So here it is. All right, so this time it's asking me for username and password. You can see here, once I type my password and log in, it will not ask me for permission, because the fact that I am authenticating using OpenID Connect, Google OpenID Connect, it is an implicit permission to access my email and my basic information. Okay, so next, and that's it. I get access to this. Now, let me show you what's going on here. I will gradually start explaining the how and what's going on. So first of all, when I authenticated to Google, Google redirected back to my app and gave it two main pieces of information. It gave my app. One is called the ID token. This is a very simple token, an ID token, and you can see here, this is a GWT token. Remember the GWT token we discussed? In fact, if I copy this, I copy this one. There's a small utility that comes with Chrome that you can install in Chrome. It's called GWT Analyzer and Inspector. I can go here to debug. I can paste this one here. And you can see here, this is what's coming from Google. This is what Google gave me.
Good information.
Yeah, this is the encoded, but I can decode it on the cloud. I can decode it. And what it's giving me, the main information, it's a bit blurry, but the main information is the account, the email, you can see there the email, and I also see an account identifier. This is my sub is called subject. This is my account identifier in Google. So it is already giving me my identification in Google. Two main pieces of information, which is the sub. This is my ID in Google, and this is my email already there. Now, also, it gave me two pieces of information. One is the ID token. If this information is enough, I don't need to go to the profile. But for my application, this information is not enough. I need to go and get further information about the user. I want to know their first name. I want to know their password. I want to know their gender. So what Google also gave me, it gave me another piece of information called access token. So after I do an OpenID Connect authentication, I get two pieces of information. An ID token, which is a JWT token. It has basic user information. And an access token. What this access token allows me to do, I can go back to another endpoint, another web API called user info web API. I give it this access token. This access token is like an authorization of the user. This is the evidence that the user have authorized me to go back to Google and get more info. So what I'll do, let me show you. I'll take this access token, I copy it, I go to my Postman, and I'll go to get user info. Let me just show you, this is an old token that I used. That token that I used before I was playing with this demo is already expired. So you can see here I get invalid credentials. But now I just logged in, I have a fresh access token. So I can go, remember, I'm going to this URL. It's called OpenID Connect. I'm going to this URL and basically asking Google, please give me more details about this user. Now Google will say, how can I give you this? You need to give me evidence that the user gave you the permission to access their profile. I'll say, yes, I have the evidence, and this evidence is encapsulated in this access token. And then I'll pass it to the Google API in the authorization header. So I'll put it here, bearer, space, and I paste it there. Now, once I paste it there, I'll go ahead and you can see here, I get all the information about this user. I have the name, first name, last name, the gender, even the picture, even whether the email was verified. You can see here with the very simple standard API, I was able to authenticate. I don't need to manage password. Google will do it for me. And then when I authenticate, I get an ID token. This ID token has basic information. If it is enough for my application, like an ID of the user and an email, if it is enough, the process can stop there. If I need to know more information about the user, I can go to another endpoint or API called user info endpoint, and I give it an access token that I received after authentication, and it gives me further details about the user. Most applications. After I log in using Google, I get all these details and store them in my own database. Why do you think most applications do this? For many other reasons. For example, I need to know what is the role of the user. In here, it doesn't give me any role. I need to add further details to these details. I need, for example, to assign roles. I need to know what is the last time they logged in to my app. I might need more richer information. So once I logged in, all these details are coming from Google. Okay. Now what I do is I take those details, as I said, and I store them in the database, and then I generate another ID token, not the one that Google gave me, I generate another ID token that has all the details coming from Google and maybe some further details that my application added. You can see here I added this roles here. So this user has a role of contributor. So in a simple app, if your application is very simple, you just want to let the user authenticate and you know who they are through their email. If this is enough for you, you don't need to go through this and get more info and generate a new JSON token from your app. But if in most application, the information coming from Google is very rich, but we need to enrich it with a little bit more data, such as the roles. And that's why I go ahead and do this on the server side and store the user details and add the role to the user. And then I generate another token ID that I return back to the application. Now, when the application starts talking back to my web application, it will use this ID token to communicate with my web API. So my web API will always use this new token that I have generated. Now, if I want to talk back with, I want to have interaction with Google again for some other reason, I will use the access token that I got from Google, this one. Okay, so there are two tokens. There is the ID token and there is the access token. So here is the idea. Here is what we saw. Here is our hero Spa app. Our application did the redirect to Google Authentication API. And within the redirect, we asked Google, when you finish authentication, please return back to us two things. We want to have an ID token, and we want to have a token. An ID token, this is the basic user information. A token is the proof that the user have grant us access to these two things. We asked Google, please, when you authenticate, give us an access token that will allow us access to two pieces of information from the user profile. The profile itself, the basic information about the user, and the email. I put this in a parameter in the URL called scope. So in most, if you use Facebook or Twitter, you will find similar experience. Especially the scope, this is where OpenID Connect standardized this. With all other providers, you will have these two scopes. There are other scopes, but you can ask for phone number, you can ask for other stuff. And all those scopes, these strings are standardized. You just put them like this. So in here, within the redirect, I pass these details as parameters in the URL. So when I redirect the user, I say to Google, please, when you finish, come back to me. I want you to give me back an ID token to know who the user is. I want you to give me a token to get even more details about the user. And please give me access, within this token, give me access to these two elements of the user data, which is the profile and the email. Okay. Now, the user is prompted with a login from Google. They type in the username and password. They press login. If everything is successful, what Google will pass back to us?
The profile.
Two things, not the profile.
Access token and ID.
Yes, the ID token. What the ID token has?
The basic profile.
Basic information, like the unique identifier of the user in Google, in a Google platform, and the email of the user. Okay, if this is enough for me, that's it, finish. But most likely, I want to welcome the user. I want to tell them I know who you are. I can address you by name, by first name. Most likely, that's why I get another token, two pieces of information. The access token, the identity token. This is a JWT token, as we've seen before. This access token, this is just a string that encapsulates the evidence that the user had granted me the authorization to go and fetch more details about them. Yes. So what I'll do, for the ID token, I can extract the email from there, the ID if I wish. The access token, what I can do, I can basically, either from the client or from the server, I can use, or even from Postman, I can go to this and user info endpoint. So I have, if you want to be an authentication provider using OpenID Connect, you need to provide two endpoints, which means two web API. One for authentication and one for getting, one for authentication and one for getting more information about the user. The first endpoint, we call it the authentication endpoint. And the second endpoint, we call it user info. This is the standard. If you don't provide these two, please don't call yourself an OpenID Connect provider. You have to provide these two endpoints. Now, this second endpoint, what it allows us to do, get more details about the user. Yes. So, and for us to get more details, what should we give this endpoint? The access token. Where do we put it? In the authorization header. We put it in the authorization header, and we say authorization header bearer space, and we put the access token. If we don't do that, we will not get access to the user profile. And I showed you this already. So in here, if you see here, if I remove this one and do an access to that URL, 403, remember the 403? Forbidden. You are not allowed. So once I put it back, hopefully it should. Yes, once I put it, it's back there. Of course, from the clients, I can access the user endpoint to get more details. But typically, as I told you, we delegate this job to the server. We tell the server, please, here is the ID token, here is the access token. Please go ahead to the endpoint, get more details about the user, save the details in our own database. You might assign a role, you might assign further details when this user was last logged in, whether they logged in before or this is the first time. That's why we need to store this information ourselves. Then we generate our own JWT token. We are not using the ID token coming from Google for two reasons. One is we cannot validate it. The ID, remember, to validate an ID token, you need to have the key that was used to generate it. So Google will, of course, will never give you the key to validate it. There are advanced scenarios where you can request the key. But in here, we'll keep it simple. We are not reusing the ID token coming from Google. We generate our own one because we need the profile of the user to have even more information, such as the role. That's why I generate my own token. And then if the app needs to talk back with the API, with the Hero app API, it should give the GW token that we generated after authentication. So to summarize, we use the OpenID Connect coming from Google just to know who the user is, to delegate the headache of maintaining the password and checking the authentication. And we get the user info. Then we generate our own user object, and we encode it into a JWT token, and we return it to the app. Now the app, it's now exactly the same as if we logged in ourselves using our own login. With one more advantage, we have this access token. If we need to go back to Google to get more, to ask the user to allow us to get access to other details. Okay. All right. So maybe I'll jump a little bit now into the code just to show you a little bit more. And then in the lab, hopefully you can practice this more. So let me show you. So what's going on here is my login page. And here is, I start with the user interface. You can see here, I basically have a button. And this button has an image called Google Sign In. And then when the user clicks this button, I basically go to authenticate. And I'll say authenticate using Google. So I'll take you to that function. So what that function is doing, if the authentication provider is local, I will use my own authentication service to validate the user identity. If it is otherwise, I will go and do it using OpenID Connect. So this is my, it's my own class called Authentication Service, and it has this OpenID, this method called authentication using OpenID. So I'll go there and show you what's going on. Okay, so for me to to redirect the users to the authentication, Google authentication screen, I need to know the URL of that Google authentication screen. Now this URL, there is no magic. You have to read the document, OpenID Connect Google documentation, and they will tell you this is the URL for the authentication endpoint. And then remember, for me in this URL, when I redirect the user to this URL, I pass these parameters. 4 parameters. I've passed 4 parameters in the query string. I append them to the URL. What are these 4 parameters? The scope. The scope, what the scope does is basically saying to Google what are the pieces from the data that I want to have access to from the user profile. I want, in this case, I am asking Google, please, I need to access the basic information about the user and the email. Now, the second parameter, very important parameter, is the client ID. What this client ID is, Google is not opening the door to anyone to use their API. They need to know who are using their API. So you, as developer, if you want to use their authentication API, you should go and register with Google, okay? So what you do, there is an app, there is a website, basically, console.developers.google.api. You go to this, you register, you create a project. In this case, for example, I created this project called QU Authentication Demo. And then when you create these projects, they give you 2 very important pieces of information. It gives you the client ID and the client secret. So now you as developer, for you to use the authentication, the OpenID Connect or other API later on, you must supply this client ID, which is logical because they need to know who you are so to authorize you to access their API. Of course, some API also has a limitation. There is some free parts, and then when you exceed the number of requests exceeds certain number, you need to start paying. So that's why Google needs to identify who they are, who is using their API. And this is true for all other providers. You must register with them, and they give you these 2 pieces of information, the client ID and the client secret. The client secret is used for advanced scenarios we will not be covering here. We will be only using the client ID. So when I redirect the user, I tell them, here is my client ID. Now, response type, I am asking Google, please give me, when the user is done with the authentication, please give me back the ID token and the access token. Yes? And then here, this is the redirect URL. When the user is done with authentication, Google will redirect back to this app. And then when it redirects, it adds to the URL these 2 pieces of information, the ID token and the access token. Now, once I do this, this is what this class is doing. It allows us to pop up the authentication window. You saw that authentication window the user had. So what that pop-up authentication window does, it's very straightforward. All it does, here there is a window. Window is the root object in the browser. I'll say here window, open. This is the URL I want you to open. And then here is a bit of tricky part. It's basically doing a timer. In this case, every 250 milliseconds, it checks whether the user has finished authenticating or not. How does it know that it's finished? When the URL has changed. When the URL has changed and we get back the access token and the ID token back from Google, then this pop-up window will be closed, and we return to the caller the access token and the ID token that was returned from Google. Okay, so in here, all you need to know that I am opening a new window that has this URL. Sorry?
For Google.
Yes, the Google URL for authentication. And this URL, if you remember, it has the pieces of information that I explained, the scope, the client ID, the response type. So what this code is doing, it will pop up the screen and it will start like a timer. Every 250 seconds, it will look at the URL. Did I get back the ID token and the access token from the Google? If yes, I will extract them and close this authentication and pass this to my app so my app can continue. Okay, so here it is, just very quickly. So I keep watching for this redirect to happen, and then once it happens, I extract the ID token and the authentication token. Sorry, the ID token and the access token. Okay. If you are interested, you can go deeper into this code, but not very relevant for the discussion. Okay. Is clear the idea? Okay. So once I am done with getting the ID token and the access token, what I'm doing here, I'm displaying them to you. You can see here, this is the ID token I got. This is the access token I got from Google. Then I am going to get the user profile. There are two ways I can do it. I can do it on the client side, similar to what I showed you here in Postman. I can go to this URL, give it this authorization access token, and get this information. I can do it on the client side, no problem whatsoever. Or, most likely, you will need to do it on the server side, so you can store it on the server side in the database. So in my case, I decided to do it on the server side. And on the server side, I am calling get user profile. Yes, I'm calling my own API, and I'm giving it the ID token and the access token. And this API on the server side, it will fetch the user details. Okay, so let me show you just very quickly the server side. Here is the authentication service, and one of the methods will be get the profile. All this get profile is doing exactly what Postman is doing. Creating an authorization header, appending the header to the request, and then doing a get request. There is a very simple simple library called Axios that allows me, similar to Fetch API, that allows me on the server side to talk to a web API. Okay, once I am done with getting the user details from Google, what I do is I store it in my database. Also, if you can see here, I add it to my database, and then I generate a JSON token based on my new user, my own user that I stored in my own database, and then I return it back to the client. So this closes the loop that I have shown you here. This closes this loop. So the client will ask the server, please go ahead, go to the Google and use user info endpoint, get more details about the user, save them to our own local database, and then return back a GW token back to the application. Is this clear? Okay, so this is the story with OpenID Connect. When do we use this OpenID Connect? We basically use it to delegate authentication. I don't need to verify the user identity myself. I'll just delegate it. There is another scenario called delegated authorization. Now, you know, on the web, users, especially using the social media, they manage a lot of rich information in multiple accounts. Let's say in Google, you might maintain your contacts in Google. You have, of course, the Gmail. You might have other information, and you want to authorize other applications to access your information. For example, in my case, let me show you in my example here. I want to authorize users, authorize the Hero app to access my Google contacts. Here are my Google contacts. So I have 2 contacts here. So I want Google API, I want my Hero app to access this. So far, if I go to my, let me sign in using this. I just want to see in my permissions I gave to other applications. I want to see the permissions that I gave before to other applications. One of them, I gave permission to Hero app. What I gave permission to, what are the scope that I gave permission to? Basic information and email. That's it. Now, this app is trying to access my contacts. What it gets? Permission denied. You need to request authorization from user to access this contact details. So even if I do so from Postman, have a look at this. I'm trying to get the contacts. It says here, invalid authentication credential. You cannot access the contact. If you want to access the user info, no problem. I will give you the user info because the user authorized you to access it. Did the user authorize me to access the contacts? No. So how do I request the user to authorize me to access the contacts?
Put the information in the scope.
Thank you very much. That's it. Remember the scope?
Yes.
So when I authenticate the user, here it is. Very good. So when I authenticate the user on the client side, it is the authentication service. All I need to do, if the user wants me to manage their contacts, I will add this to the scope. I have to add this to the scope. Now, email and profile are standard, but contacts is application specific. So the scope is a bit large. This is the scope. According to Google, you have to go to the documentation, and they will tell you if you want to access the contacts of the user, you need to add this. You need to request this scope. Now, when I request this scope, what will happen? What do you think will happen when the user logs in?
We'll ask them for the permission to allow or not.
Yes, we'll ask the user to whether the user is allowed to access their contacts or not. So let us do that experience. Here it is. So I log out, and I will check this box saying, I want this app to manage my contacts. Now, when I sign in, of course, it will ask me username, password, all right? And then it's asking me here. You see this? They're asking me, this Hero app is trying to manage your contacts. Not only reading them, it will delete, add, update. Do we agree? Allow it or not allow it? Allow it, no problem. Okay, allow. What do you think will happen once I allow? You see here, I am able to get all the contacts from Google, and I was able to read them and display them here. And not only this, I can also, if I wish, I can delete them. Okay. And I refresh my Google contacts, that contact is gone. Okay. Now, the flow is exactly the same as OpenID Connect, except here, the access token allows me more permissions. So now if I go to here, let me just grab this access token here. It's exactly same concept. I take this access token, go to Postman, and then change this old one with the new one. And suddenly, no, sorry, let me try it here. Yep. Here it is. So let me try it here. Okay. Yes, you can see here I can get all the contacts now. Not only this, I can also create a contact. I didn't provide a UI to do this, but I can do it using Postman. So all I need to do now, I go to headers, change this. Every time I log in and authorize, I will get a different access code. See, this one has created new contacts. So if I go here, body, these are the details of the new contact. If I go to my contacts, you can see them here, nicely done in my Google contacts. And also you see this John Doe, and also in my client. If I refresh, yes, you can see them there. Okay, so the flow of OpenID Connect is for delegating authentication, and for delegated authorization, the standard is called OAuth. The latest version of this standard is OAuth 2.0. So this is for delegated authorization. Now, in fact, although I discussed with you OpenID Connect first, but really, if you look carefully, OpenID Connect is built on top of this OAuth 2.0. So let me show you the flow just to conclude. Here is what's going on here. So the authorization flow is very similar to the authentication flow, by the way. You can see here I redirect the user to the authorization endpoint. And of course, before they can authorize me, Google need to know who they are. So that's why authentication is always a prerequisite to authorization. So they will authenticate. Now here the scope is contacts. So Google will ask them, do you want to allow this app to access your contacts? If they allow, the authorization will send back an access token. The authorization will send back an access token. And then I use that access token either on the client side or on the server side to interact with the contacts. So the terminology here, because OAuth is a standard, the terminology that they use, the client is, first of all, the resource owner. Who is the resource owner in our case? The user. No, the resource owner is the user. They own the contacts, not Google who own the contacts. That's the resource owner. The resource owner comes to a client. It's basically the app. They are coming to use the services of this application. Now, the client will talk to an authorization service or an authorization server. In this case, the Google accounts or Google authorization server. And then Google authorization server will give an access token to the client, and the client will use it to talk to the resource server. So the resource server is the one managing the contacts in our case. So this is the terminology that is being used. So I hope it is clear. This is the way really delegated authentication and delegated authorization is heavily used out there, especially for accessing web API.